Okay, so good evening, everyone here in Ohio and anyone joining us from anywhere else around the United States. We want to welcome you. My name is Rachel Isaacson, and I'm with the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions, and I'll be serving as tonight's Zoom host. On behalf of the Black Farming Beyond 40 Acres and a Mule Conference Committee, we are thrilled to have you join us in what we believe will be an exceptional program. So before we get started, I wanted to go over a few technical pieces for this evening's program. Annalisa will be having 30 to 45 minutes of answering questions at the end of her presentation. So feel free to put your questions as you have them in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them as we can. Please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A section and not the chat box, as your questions will more likely be lost in the chat space. Once your question is in the Q&A section, other attendees will be able to see your question and be able to upvote which questions they'd like answered the most. Please remain respectful as we'll be moderating this session. This conference is being presented by Central State University, the Arthur Morgan Institute for Community Solutions, the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center, and Antioch College. We want to take a moment to thank our generous sponsors that ensure our conference became a success. We especially want to thank our lead sponsors of this conference, Nationwide Insurance and the Ohio Farm Bureau Federation, for their generous donation and support. And to all of our other sponsors and supporters, we thank you so much. We have a few other supporters and volunteers who are also listed in our program. And we also encourage you to take a look at the conference program, as in the last page, we have a resource page that all of our sponsors and presenters provided resources to our attendees. We want to thank the National Afro-American Museum and the Cultural Center for being such a great partner. We could have not done this without your support and partnership in the planning of this conference. I am pleased to introduce our first speaker of this evening, Ms. Jerolyn Barbee. Ms. Barbee serves as an Assistant Director of the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center, which is also tonight's co-host. The museum is part of the Ohio History Connection system of historic sites and museums. Ms. Barbee manages all the programming activities and staff. She also has over 35 years of experience at developing innovative community-based programs and service delivery coordination for federally and foundation-funded programs. She has professional and volunteer experience in the areas of fundraising, media relations, and special event planning. I am pleased to introduce Ms. Barbee.
Thanks, Rachel. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program this evening. Again, I'm Jerolyn Barbee, and this is the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center. As Rachel said, we're part of the Ohio History Connection, and our museum is located about 60 miles from Columbus, right outside of Xenia on the campus of Historically Black College, Central State University. Before we get started, we wanted to, be sure to maybe understand more about our audience. So we have some poll questions that'll kind of pop up, I think, 3 times during this evening's presentation. The first question is, we'd just like to know how many of you have ever visited the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center. So Rachel, pop up the question. If you don't mind answering it, that'd be great. This is part of our mission. And we really are excited about collaborating with the Black Farming Conference and also by offering more online programming. And that's what we're doing, as well as participating in this evening's program. And the bonus of doing all this is that now we can provide programming to not only people from across Ohio, we also are touching people from all across the country. Here at the museum, we provided a great calendar of online programming that's on our Facebook page and on our website. So, and I think during our resource information, you can get that information as well. But just Google us on Facebook, National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center. Now I'm going to show you a brief video overview of the National Afro-American Museum and Cultural Center. And after the video, I'll introduce my co-host for the evening, Dr. Kevin McGruder, Vice President of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of History at Antioch College. Thanks again for joining us this evening. So let's now check out the video.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and end polling. Here's the video. All right, thank you.
All right, thanks, Rachel. Up next is Dr. Kevin McGruder, as I said earlier, and I'll let Kevin tell you a little bit about himself as well as introduce Annalisa Cox.
Thank you, Jerolyn. I am, as Jerolyn said, I'm Vice President of Academic Affairs and Associate Professor of History at Antioch College in Yellow Springs, Ohio. And it's my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening, Dr. Annalisa Cox. She is an award-winning American historian whose original research underpinned 2 exhibits at the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture. Her writing has been featured in a number of publications, including the Washington Post, Lapham's Quarterly, and the New York Times. Her newest book, The Bone and Sinew of the Land, was honored by the Smithsonian Magazine as one of the best history books of 2018. Professor Henry Louis Gates praised it for being a revelation of primary historical research that is written with the beauty and emphatic powers of a novel. And Professor Ibram Kendi lauded it for being a groundbreaking work of research. Dr. Cox is currently a judge for the LA Times History Book Awards and is a non-resident fellow at Harvard University's Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. She is completing a year-long project for the Library of Congress Folklife Center, collecting oral histories for multi-generational African American farmers in the Midwest. And we met a little over a year ago at the Midwestern History Association's annual meeting. And that was in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And we were commiserating after a presentation. And when I talked about Yellow Springs, I told her about all the events and activities related to farming that were going on here. And she offered that if we ever had anything that we wanted to invite her to, she would be open to that invitation. So I thank her for following up on that. And now it's my pleasure to present Dr. Annalisa Cox.
Thank you so much, Dr. McGruder. I am honored to be here. This is actually one of the first Zoom discussions that I've ever done. So it's a little bit interesting for me, and I'm sure it's interesting for you. I'm sorry if it's hard for some of you to get in. Rachel and the technical team were really careful with safety, just because there's been a lot of issues with these kind of Zoom conferences that are dealing with issues of racism and race being Zoom bombed. So thank you, Rachel, for keeping us protected. And it means it's a lot harder to get in. So I do apologize for that. And this is being recorded. So if any of you cannot get in or can't see everything, there will be a chance to see it later. But I do hope that you'll think of plenty of questions, because I'm going to keep this fairly brief. It's a little bit hard, I think, to just focus on a computer screen for a long time. I prefer to be in discussion with all of you to be able to answer questions. So I'm actually going to make my talk briefer than the Q&A period. But I'm actually calling my talk tonight, The First Tillers of the Land, the Deep Roots of African-American Farming in the Midwest. So I'm actually going to take us back to before the Civil War. So the Civil War starts in 1861. A whole lot of African Americans from the Midwest fight in that war to end slavery. So they're a part of that struggle. But this is all happening before that war, before the end of slavery, during a time period that a lot of historians have assumed there were very few African Americans in the Midwest and very few African American farmers. I'm going to start with a story, because I like to start with stories. Aaron Siddles was a wealthy and established African-American farmer living in a rural area of the Midwest in the 1840s, over 160 years ago, and long before the Civil War. After years of danger and brutal toil, Aaron Siddles and his family now lived on one of the loveliest farms in the region. He had been comfortably situated and on good terms with the other local elites. He was one of the elites, the white doctor being a particular friend. But the whites who arrived after Aaron Siddles were not happy with his success. Some men had attacked his home, throwing bricks through his expensive glass windows. So Aaron Siddles had shot at them, using small shot that would have stung their hind parts when it hit them. The doctor may have laughingly recounted to Siddles how the men had limped into his office asking for the buckshot to be removed from that delicate part of their anatomy. But Siddles was furious. He knew his standing in the community made him safe from retaliation for shooting those white men who attacked his home, but he wanted to sue the men for the damage to his house. And whites in his Midwestern state had voted to make such an action illegal. No black man could testify or take to court a white man in his state, or most states in the Midwest. This right was widely known as one's oath, and to lose it was to lose one's voice and one's protection. Let me give you an example. Imagine you are a black dairy farmer in the Midwest 180 years ago. And yes, there were black dairy farmers in the Midwest 180 years ago with a large herd of milk cows. You have many of them in your barn and you're milking them with your wife and children when a group of white men run in with torches and set the hay and the barn on fire. You barely escape with your lives, and many of your cows are killed as the barn burns to the ground. Even though you and your family could identify those men, you were not allowed to testify against them, nor could you take them to court. Aaron Siddles would later bitterly recount, and I quote him, "I was dissatisfied with the laws of that country. I had a good deal of property there. It was not safe, for any loafing white might destroy or steal, and unless a white man were by to see it, I could get no redress." End quote. So even with loyal white friends, Siddles knew that his home state's prejudiced laws, combined with the fugitive slave law, put him and his family in too much danger. So he gave up on the United States and left for Canada. Let's be clear here. This is a free man who was born free in the South, came to the Midwest, but left for Canada because of racism. But the move broke his heart. As he later admitted, and I quote, "Excepting for the oppressive laws, I would rather have remained. I left one of the most beautiful places in that country. Everybody who sees it says it is a beautiful place. I had a 2-story frame house with piazza, good stable, and every arrangement about the premises was nice and convenient." His love and his longing for his land, for his ground, comes through in this quote from before the Civil War. And I want, as I continue this talk, to remember this love, this longing for the land. A beautiful place, a lovely frame house, good farmland, all before the Civil War started. To many, this would seem an impossibility. Didn't African Americans arrive in the Midwest in the 20th century as part of the Great Migration? Weren't they urban? Yes, those things happened, but there was an earlier Great Migration, the movement of tens of thousands of African Americans, many of them born free, who moved into the Midwest by the thousands in the earliest days of settlement of Ohio and the Midwest. Aaron Siddles was one of over 63,000 African Americans who were living in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin before the Civil War. And they were living primarily in rural regions, farming land that they owned in over 330 African American farming communities scattered across those 5 states. And Rachel, if you could show that map of the farming settlements, I'd appreciate it.
Okay.
As you'll see from this map, there are 95 settlements in Ohio alone, and this is a really conservative map. So the map from the book, we'll find it.
Right
there it is. So this is actually a map from the front of my book, and it's a conservative map because I was only counting communities where there were people of African descent who were terming themselves farmers who owned property. But there were many wealthy African American farmers in Ohio who would not allow themselves to be counted in the census, such as John Langston, who was a very wealthy African American farmer, in addition to being a lawyer and an elected official in Ohio before the Civil War. He refused to be counted in either the agricultural or the federal census in protest against the racism of the federal government. So we have to remember that these are really, really conservative numbers. Also, it doesn't count other African American propertied rural entrepreneurs like blacksmiths, general store owners, and so many more. So again, this is a super conservative map. Now, 63,000 may seem like a small number, but it was not at the time. It was a state's worth of African Americans in these 5 states. The Northwest Territorial Ordinance of 1787 stated that there must be at least 60,000 non-native people in a territory for it to become a state. So this is a state's worth. And it is also hard for us to remember, it's even hard for me to remember, what a small country the United States was when African Americans first started moving to Ohio and the Midwest to settle on this frontier at the territorial time in the 1790s. So we were barely a nation at this time, and already African descended people were homesteading this frontier. Rachel, could you pull up that funny full color map? There it is. Yep. Okay. So this is actually the United States and Canada in 1794. So the United States is green, and it's a little oddly shaped, right? But when African descended people were moving out of Virginia, out of North Carolina, out of Maryland, out of Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, to come to Ohio and settle there, this is the United States. And this wasn't the Midwest. this was the West. In fact, some even called it the Great West, right? How could it be the Midwest? There's no mid, right? So we just sort of need to remember this as we're talking about this history. Also, it's smaller in population. And this is really important because there's an intimacy and a connectivity to these communities. They're highly visible pioneers, highly visible farms. Their success is highly visible. And because of how small the populations are. So let me give you an example. In 1830, so 30 years before the Civil War, the total United States population was under 13 million people. Today, the total population of the state of Ohio is about an 11.5 million. So imagine that the United States in 1830, that's the entire population plus 2 million, okay? So it's just a couple million more than Ohio is today. And also, I want to be really clear when we talk about rural versus urban during this period, what urban meant. And I know people are always going on and on about how boring historians are talking about numbers, but these numbers really matter. They're kind of shocking. By 1830, the city with the largest population in the United States was New York City, and its total population was around 202,000. 202,000, okay? After that, no city in this country was larger than 80,000. Okay, today we'd call that a town, right? And half of the top largest cities in the US, the top sort of, were 30,000 or under. And only one of those cities in the top 10 was in the Midwest. It was Cincinnati. And in 1830, it had about 25,000 residents. 25,000, the great big city of Cincinnati, okay? St. Louis was just over 14,000 people. In 1830, Chicago was a fort, and Detroit was a small village of 2,200 people. So this is the United States that these African-descended people are coming to, and they are not coming to cities. They're coming to farm. So to understand this history, we must also understand what was happening in the Midwest before the Civil War. Today it's called the Midwest, the middle of the United States. But in 1800, 1810, 1820, and 1830, it was not the middle, it was the West, and it was the frontier. So those Northwest Territory states of Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin saw one of the fastest and largest movements of people onto a frontier to have ever occurred in human history up until that point. Between 1787 and 1838, over 4 million settlers moved into this region in just 50 years. I mean, it's amazing the planet didn't tilt. You know, that's a lot of people. And they were moving to its rural regions, not cities. And at this time, success meant owning good land and farming it well. And African Americans did farm the land well. They came early, they picked out excellent land, and they succeeded. This is not what history books have told us. This is not what most people think of when they think of the Midwest. But these are the facts, facts that have been denied and ignored in favor of a narrative that imagines the rural Midwest as lily white, and the only Black people who arrived here before the Civil War were fearfully escaping on the Underground Railroad and only able to succeed to be free because of the benevolence of kindly white people. That's the popular narrative, right? This narrative certainly makes white people who look like me look good, but unfortunately, it's mainly a myth. Or fortunately, actually, I would say it's mainly a myth. African Americans were living and farming in the Midwest before many white people got here, and they did better than many of their white neighbors. And the racism that arose in the Midwest arose in the face of Black success, not Black failure. And Rachel, I don't know if I'm back on screen again, but I'd be glad to be back on screen at this point.
Great.
So again, I just want to reiterate that racism that arose in the Midwest arose in the face of Black success, not Black failure. And African-American farmers had to face incredible violence and racism from white neighbors and from some of the most powerful elite whites in their state, including in Ohio, because of that success before the Civil War. The sad fact is that the Midwest does not look like the map in the front of my book anymore. Not even close. And the loss of this land, the loss of these communities was deliberate. It took energy, it took planning, and often it took violence to create white communities and white farming counties across the Midwest. But let's go back to that success for a moment. Today, we talk about Black Wall Street. But when talking about the Midwest, it is essential to talk about the success of these farmers before the Civil War. Many of these farmers, as my book shows, were not just subsistence farmers. They were wealthy. And some were what I call landed gentry. Rachel, could you show some of the photos of the Array and Day families, as well as of Enoch and Deborah Harris, as I talk for this next couple minutes?
Yeah, I'll get that up when I continue talking.
To be clear, many of these African Americans were arriving in Ohio before photography was invented. So I want to be clear here. These photographs that are very old, so these are all photographs from before the Civil War, but they are late in terms of Black settlement. You can just sort of keep toggling back and forth between these 4 or 5 photos. Many of the African Americans arriving in Ohio were there before photography was invented, in the days of Jane Austen and Pride and Prejudice. But I want you to see these images of men in silk waistcoats and women in silk dresses to give you an idea of the wealth these farmers and farms were generating. And the book, can you hold on to that? Oh, go back just a minute, Rachel. That woman with the book. There we are. And the book beside the arm of the woman in the beautiful silk dress is a sign to the viewer. She wants you to know she can read.
Wow.
The Array and Day families were descendants. So this is a descendant of the Array and Day families, were descendants of a Black Revolutionary War patriot soldier who came out to Michigan in the 1810s, before there was a city of Detroit, before statehood, and they became wealthy wheat farmers. And then if you could toggle to Enoch and Deborah Harris, the couple. There you go, there we go. Now that's Enoch and Deborah Harris. Enoch Harris came to the Ohio frontier before the War of 1812 and was the first settler in his Ohio township. We're talking about land deed number 1. He's not unique in this, okay? There are African-American homesteaders and pioneers who are literally, I've found the deed books, deed number 1 in their township. He fought in the War of 1812 and was given hundreds of acres of land in the Michigan Territory in exchange and thanks for his service. When he and his wife, Deborah, moved to Michigan in the 1820s, they brought invaluable knowledge with them, for they had been neighbors to a man called John Chapman in Ohio, a man most of you know as Johnny Appleseed. So when they moved to Michigan, they planted one of the first apple orchards in that state, and Enoch and Deborah became wealthy, making some of the best apple brandy in that region. And there were more. You can go back to my face if that's okay. This is very brief, but I'm just going to read a couple more examples from my book. Arthur Allen decided to leave North Carolina even before that state turned its back on his voting rights. Whites in North Carolina abolished voting rights in 1838, but he left the state before then. He was drawn by word of the good farming land available in Illinois. He and his wife were in their 40s with 8 children when they moved from Northampton County, North Carolina, to Illinois in the late 1820s. So Illinois was barely a state. They were free and came with enough money to pay cash for a settled farm of 80 acres, including a house and a barn that a white family was selling. At his death in 1840, Arthur Allen owned 320 acres and had loaned over $700 to local white farmers. In addition, 4 of his sons and a son-in-law owned over 1,000 acres of farmland combined, making the Allen family the equivalent of landed gentry in that county. They literally, that family owned the most land of any family in that county, white or black. Another group of wealthy free African-American families fled the area around Richmond, Virginia, just after Nat Turner's rebellion. While they traveled together, once they arrived in Ohio, they scattered across the countryside, finding the farmland that suited them best, and it was good farmland. Abraham and Mary Goody Depp chose Concord Township in Delaware County, where they bought around 600 acres worth over $7,500 by 1850. This is the equivalent of millionaires, right? Their fellow pioneers, Pleasant and Catherine Litchford, bought a similar massive estate of land in the township of Perry in Franklin County. Pleasant Litchford had been born around 1789, and like Arthur Allen and many of his fellow travelers, he was approaching middle age when he and his family arrived in the old Northwest Territories. In 1850, his land was worth $8,000, making him one of the 4 wealthiest landowners of any color in his Ohio township. So what did it mean to succeed as a farmer before the Civil War in the Midwest? Well, ground meant rights. It meant when you first came there that you could vote when you first came there. So in 1787, when the Northwest Territorial Ordinance was written, the word white is not included in that ordinance. That means that there are equal rights for all the people who settle there. And if you owned 50 acres of land and you were male, you could vote regardless of the color of your skin. And African Americans did come and did buy land and did vote across this whole region. This was really our nation's first civil rights movement. African Americans had fought, they had struggled to create this country, and they had fought for equal rights, and they were getting them in this region. This is right before the War of 1812, before the Civil War. Propertied black men were voting in the Midwest. So if you had land, you could vote. It meant citizenship. And when that right was stolen, and it was stolen very early in Ohio with statehood in 1803, the whites who created the first Ohio Constitution put the word in white to who could vote and who was considered a citizen, stealing the right from some of the earliest black citizens of Ohio. But those black farmers stayed. They used their land and wealth to fight that injustice. I want to just give you a really quick list of a few names of very, very wealthy farmers who actually organized this revolution against this inequality that was occurring, this backlash that was occurring. They created Black convention movements, which are kind of big conferences where people would come from all over the state and gather and talk and organize about how to regain the rights that had been stolen from them. There was Noah Nooks, who in 1850 had a farm worth over $3,000. There was Lewis Adams in Champaign County, Ohio. Again, all these farmers own land that's worth over $1,000. They're really wealthy. John Mercer Langston, who I mentioned before, Thomas Brown in Lorain County, George Adams in Pickaway, Pleasant Litchford in Franklin, Cyrus King in Clinton County, David Barnett in Pike County, William Morgan in Logan County. All of these wealthy, landed, organizing, equal rights activist farmers in Ohio before the Civil War. And when we talk about value, I want to talk about taxes here very, very quickly. Because when I say that Pleasant Litchford had land worth well over $8,000 in 1850, we have to take these values with a grain of salt. Because most farmers, both black and white, underreported their wealth for tax purposes. But African-American farmers had an additional reason to do that in Ohio, and that was with the first laws in the early 1830s, creating that first public school system in Ohio that Buckeyes are so proud of. African Americans were excluded from that public school system, but their land was taxed for schools that their children could not attend. So they had every reason to undervalue their land and their farms and their properties because they didn't want to be taxed for schools that their children couldn't attend. I also want to add here that some local historians have described Pleasant Litchford and other early African Americans in Ohio as freedom seekers who escaped from bondage, but the record does not bear this out. The Litchfords and Depps and many of the other wealthy farmers in Ohio were long free and propertied people before they came to Ohio. So it's really important to remember this. And as soon as they arrived in Ohio, they bought those huge tracts of land. Yet today, their history continues to be erased, even though they were some of the earliest settlers of land around what is now Columbus. I should add here that the history of African Americans in Ohio has been hurt by an obsession with the Underground Railroad. And this sounds like an odd thing to say, but I really kind of want to stress this, or at least one version of the Underground Railroad sort of myth. This mythical version that has all Black people arriving in Ohio as freedom seekers, being helped by benevolent white folks in Ohio. In reality, the vast majority of African descended people in Ohio before the Civil War were free before they came to Ohio. They had to be, because Ohio had such vicious anti-immigration laws. It was almost impossible to come in and purchase land if you didn't have free papers proving that you were free. Now, some people forged them, and some people were able to get around this law, but the laws were often enforced. And many of them settled in Ohio before white people were here in that region and became effective Underground Railroad operatives before a few white people joined them in that work. And Cheryl LaRoche has talked in detail about this important history of African-American underground operatives, and I'd strongly recommend that you check out her book. I also want to talk briefly about what it took to farm. I know we got started late, but I want to end here pretty quickly. But it's really important to remember that this is before tractors, this is before combines, this is before pesticides and herbicides. So today, a large wealthy farmer in Ohio might own thousands of acres. But a really, really wealthy farmer before the Civil War, that was actually an impossible amount of land to farm. So yes, there were white plantation owners in the South who enslaved hundreds of people to farm thousands of acres. But in the Midwest, a large farm was usually, the largest farms were 1,000 to 2,000 acres. And this is about free people and free labor. And in order to run these farms, these African Americans had to hire white people to actually harvest their crops for them and plow their land for them, because you had to walk 9 miles to plow 1 acre of land with a single blade plow. And a healthy person who really knew what they were doing, a healthy young person, could only harvest a 1/4 acre of wheat a day with a scythe. So those photographs you saw earlier of those wealthy Array and Day families from Michigan, and she was in her silk dress, that was coming from the labor of white people that they were hiring to harvest the grain at harvest time for them, okay? These were elites, for sure, in this region. And again, racism arose as a backlash against this rising. And the backlash took many forms. It took legal forms, but there was also violence. Whites burned down the schools that African Americans built to educate their children in, and they burned churches in rural regions, and they taxed the farms themselves. This kind of racism on the ground took on a form of what I call a long-term terrorism. For example, when I recently interviewed an African-descended farmer for the Library of Congress for my project, he told me that the first major argument he got into with his father, this would have been in the late 60s or early 70s, when he was starting to farm the family ground that had been in the family for generations in the Midwest. His father said to him, "We will not build a barn. We do not build barns." And he wanted to build a barn. And he said, "Why not?" And his father said, "We do not build barns because it becomes a target. If we build a barn, then white people will come and they will burn it down, and we will lose all of our crops stored in there. We will lose our livestock. We will lose our equipment." This man was speaking from experience. So this is African-American farmers who are literally succeeding without barns in the Midwest and Midwest winters because they cannot build a barn because they know that local whites will burn it down. But I digress. Let us return to the 1830s, almost 200 years ago. So I'm going to skip this because we're running out of time. It's some nice little stories about some of these wealthy farmers and what they did. But I just want to add here, because I want to continue to have some Q&A, that the majority of these Black farming families did not leave because they got tired or bored of farming. There are some white historians who have argued that the reason the Midwest does not look like that map anymore is because African-American farmers just weren't interested in farming anymore, and they wanted to move to the cities. Most left because they were forced to leave. This was their ground, the land they had purchased, improved, and loved. And we need to remember this as we think about this. In fact, in the 1840s, almost 20 years before the Civil War, a Black human rights leader in Ohio spoke these words at a convention they organized to stand up to racism. And he's talking about the ways that whites had stolen their rights. And I quote, "The Declaration of Independence, the American Bill of Rights, the Ordinance of 1787, as well as the political creed of every intelligent, generous, and patriotic freeman are clearly violated, nay, shamefully desecrated by that feature of our state constitution that renders the color of the skin as qualification for electors and suffrages. We shall urge our second plea upon the ground of justice. Do unto others as you would have them do to you." And back in 1829, even earlier than this, the African-American bishop, Richard Allen, wrote, "This land, which we have watered with our tears and our blood, is now our mother country." Thank you. I will end there.
Thank you so much. We are now going to open up the floor for the screen for your questions. You'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A box. Your questions should go there. And we've got probably about 35 minutes or so to handle questions. And we're going to start with Martha Lawson has two questions. Why were Black landowners not represented in the territorial legislation that wrote the Ohio State Constitution? And then the second part of that is, did these landowners lose their land for some reason after statehood?
Great question, Ms. Lawson. I am not sure. I'm pretty sure they were barred from the first state convention, although I do know that they were voting for their the conference attendees, the convention attendees. So that they were actually voting for attendees that actually didn't protect their rights to vote, right? So it's this, like this catch-22 that's going on here. Actually, the number of African-American farmers and landowners grew after statehood. So they didn't give up right? They had real grit, they had real tenacity, and they had real hope. So African Americans continued to move onto the Ohio frontier and purchase good land and farm it well. Where you start seeing the real vicious backlash is in the 1850s. But I will add here that W.E.B. Du Bois, in one of his first projects he ever did as a graduate student around the turn of the century, he did a project for the federal census in 1890, looking at African American farmers, and he found that the region of the United States where African American farmers owned the most and best land, so like the most valuable and the most improved land, was the Midwestern region. So even by 1890, this was still a really unique and unusual region for African American farmers. And I think we need to remember that really, really important information from 1890 when we think about the rise of the Klan in the Midwest in the 1920s, the 1910s and the 1920s. The rise of Jim Crow and racism and the Klan was not just a Southern thing. It was a massively Midwest thing. And the violence, especially the legal and political violence that occurred. And I just have to say this because I know the USDA is helping to fund this conference, but in the 1930s and 1940s and 50s, the USDA was weaponized at the local level. And there were even ways in which the loan program was either denied to African American farmers or used to steal land from African American farmers. And I've heard a lot of stories about this as I've been collecting oral histories, stories of loans given, then called in, and then corruption as these some of them, even USDA officials showing up to land auctions, purchasing the land that they had foreclosed on. So there's a lot of hurt and damage that is going on during the 20th century that sees African American farmers losing their land.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Stephen Rowe asks, when did these Black landowners receive their freedom before migrating to the West?
Interesting question. So for the Array and Day family, these were free African Americans in New Jersey that may have been free for 50 years before the American Revolution. Some of these families that I've tracked that are settling in the Midwest before the Civil War, they are free by like the late 1600s. The Goins family, and there are Goins family members all over the Midwest. The Goins family, they're members of the Goins family outside of Jamestown, okay, in the 1600s. So, there was this really interesting thing that happened, and I talk in great detail about it in my book, so I'll let you go to that point. But right after the during and after the American Revolution, there was actually a fervor for freedom. And a lot of slave states flipped and became non-slave states. It wasn't perfect and it was slow, but there was a growing movement of freedom and a growing population of free African descended people, some of whom fought in the American Revolution.
Thank you. An attendee asks, well, first they thank you for your talk, and then they ask, where could one find this recording online? Oh, that's for us in general. The plan is to have that on the Community Solutions website very soon.
And I want to add here, I just want to interrupt that if you don't have a chance for me to answer your question, Rachel's going to be putting up a list of sort of good websites and stuff, and it includes my website with ways to contact me via email. I do respond to email, and I can answer your questions. We can sort of, I mean, if this was a conference, we'd all be going out and afterwards and gathering and sipping water or whatever, and you'd be able to come over and talk to me, and we're not having that chance, but I invite you to have that chance if you don't have this chance during the video.
Great. Sharon Brower asks, who or what inspired you to write this book?
That's a bit of a hard question. It came out of my first book, A Stronger Kinship. But I thought about that a lot because I've been asked that question a lot. And obviously I have really pale skin, but it seemed like an act of justice, truly, I shouldn't have had to have been the one to write this book. White historians and the white population of the Midwest in the United States should have been listening to African Americans and to their history and to their truths in this region for a long time. And there has been erasure and denial for a really long time. People with my skin color were responsible for a lot of these atrocities that happen in the Midwest. Historians with my skin color have been responsible for erasing and denying this history. So I really wanted to sort of begin to right that injustice as best I could, knowing that I wouldn't do a perfect job and hoping that others would follow. But it's a hard row to hoe because there's been a lot of resistance against this history, a lot of resistance, as Kevin knows.
Great. Rebecca Azaran asks, she says, I'm fascinated and horrified by the effective prohibition of Black-owned barns. How did they cope with that handicap? Did the Black farmers keep cellars or other kinds of underground storage?
That's a really, they found amazing ways. So in some areas, in some regions, they were able to have barns. This is one particular region of Indiana. But if you go to the Clemens home in Western Ohio, there's a barn that they built there in the 1830s that is one of the most beautiful and grand barns I've ever seen in my life. And that, you can look up the Clemens home and their website. They have a beautiful mansion. They helped fund and found an incredible revolutionary school in the 1840s just across the border in Indiana, which was open. It was pre-collegiate. It was open to Blacks and whites, girls and boys, that even encouraged interracial dating. This is in 1845. So there were pockets where there were different possibilities. And I should be very clear, that map from 1850, sort of 1850, 1860, those communities would not have been able to exist if there was outright attack and terrorism happening every moment against them. There were some areas where there were tolerance. I would say that violence grew later. And in some areas it was earlier. Frederick Douglass was attacked in an all-white county in Indiana, which had already chosen to keep African Americans out. And I want to be very clear here. If there's a county by 1850 in Ohio, Indiana, or Illinois that is all white, that's because the whites had either driven the African Americans out or kept them out. But there were other areas where it was possible for African Americans to settle. But as my book shows in my last chapter, actual outright wars were waged against African American farmers, with 100 men with guns and a cannon marching on a wealthy African American farm in the Midwest. These things did happen.
Zoe Plakias says, I understand that there was a major backlash by whites following Black success and gains in the power in the South during Reconstruction. Was there a parallel backlash that occurred in the Midwest during this period related to what was happening in the South?
That's a great question, Zoe. I would argue yes, that this rise in equal rights that occurred under the Northwest Territorial Ordinance and the amount and quality of the land and success of these farmers that was occurring before the Civil War did have this period of advancement and backlash. And in fact, the quote that I wasn't able to read to you was by this really interesting, really progressive white Oxford professor called Edward Abdy, and his book is available for free on Google Books. He wrote it in 1833, and he toured around the United States, and he visited an African American farming community in Indiana, and he interviews them and he talks to them, and they said, when we moved here in 1819, the whites were fine with us. We were all clearing our land, we were trying to get by, we were trying to survive. And now, in 1832, the eyes of the local whites are turning to us in jealousy, right? Our farms are better than them, our families are thriving, and whites are basically coveting our land and jealous of what we've achieved.
Thank you. Sharon Brower asked, did you have any difficulty with the Black people sharing their stories with you?
I'm deeply, deeply grateful to the descendants of these African-American pioneers and farmers who opened up their lives and their histories. I could not have told this history without them. And I tried to do it in partnership with them. Truly, they should have been listened to on their own. I was just basically trying to bear witness to the sort of elite academy that had been denying their voices for so long. But I don't think I could have, it took years, and I understand why. Like, these farmers and these families have been betrayed by people with my skin color and really hurt for a long time. But I could not have done this if after 2 years somebody had said, you know, you should really talk to my auntie down in Dallas. She's been doing genealogy, and she really has a lot of the records, and she has the family Bible. And then talking to that auntie, you know, I'm covering 5 states, thousands of people, hundreds of settlements. There's no way I could have done this on my own. This was a collaborative and a group effort, and I'm grateful to every single family that worked with me on this.
Royce James asked whether you can draw parallels to the plight of Black farm and landowners, their exodus due to legal institutional terrorism, and how that power structure presents itself in predatory lending and housing projects in the 1970s to today.
I'd say, you know, we have this weird dichotomy of rural versus urban as if they're completely different, right? But institutional racism and even the term predatory lending is something that is not foreign to the rural regions. It's not foreign to these farmers. And it is one of the ways, in fact, many of the farmers that I talked to recently will not take a loan for anything. As one of them said to me, I've always owned a used tractor because I've always paid cash for everything. If I take a loan, I'll lose my farm.
Brian Rowe asked, did the census or the agricultural census track farmer numbers by race before the Civil War?
That's a really interesting question, and it's something that's really intrigued me. So the agricultural census is separate from the federal people census, right? But there's something about these old notions from the American Revolution, right, of what a citizen is, and about property ownership that infused the agricultural census in some really interesting ways. So the agricultural census, especially like in the Midwest, there was no place, the federal agricultural census before the Civil War has no place to state the race of the owner, of the farm, of the farmer. Sometimes a census taker would add a little something, like try to squeeze it in, but the only way I could tell the race of farmers and the agricultural census is to go to the federal census where race is broken out, right? So there's something oddly kind of egalitarian about the agricultural census, which I think is a vestige of these revolutionary sort of Declaration of Independence ideals that all men are created equal with an equal right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which we're so used to that phrase, but it really is a strange one, and it really is revolutionary, and we really haven't kept to it. But it's something I find really intriguing. I'm sorry, I'm geeking out about the agricultural census. I will stop, but it is really intriguing.
Thank you. Robin Henderson asked, are there any remaining generational Black-owned farms that survived?
Absolutely, absolutely. So the other myth is the myth of like Black disappearance, right? The myth that African-American farmers no longer exist in the Midwest. And it's one of the most devastating myths out there. over and over again, when I've been talking to multi-generational African-American farmers, some of them working land that has been in their family for 200 years, okay? We're talking deep, deep roots. And they said one of them said to me that he had talked to a USDA official who had denied him a loan for, obviously racist reasons. And he said, you know what? I know that I can get away with this because nobody knows you're here, right? So this erasure is violence. And in his violence, this sort of popular myth of the white rural frontier, the white rural region, Midwest today, is still doing damage to these African-American farmers, because when injustice is being done to them, people will write articles about farmers in the South and farmers in California, but they don't write about African-American farmers in the Midwest because they assume they aren't, there is no there. And it's also damaging. I mean, I'm a parent, and it just really hurt me talking to some of these farmers and saying when they were growing up in these regions, they would think to themselves, what am I doing here? They'd read textbooks in which they were told they didn't exist, right? And yet their families knew that they had been there since before statehood. So this erasure is a form of violence.
Noreen Warnock asked, is there a list of Ohio Black farmers who are farming today?
I wish. And I wanted to say that I'm at the very end of my Library of Congress project, but if there are any African-American farmers in Ohio who would like to be included and have their narratives included in this Library of Congress project, please contact me. I know we're in the middle of pandemic, so I might have to push it off a little bit before I can sort of come to your home with recording equipment, but your stories are really important. There is no list, unfortunately. And in fact, finding these histories and writing the bone and sinew of the land was very difficult, because where do you even start when, there isn't even supposed to be this history, right? And it started with sort of a few families, then moved out from there.
Someone asked, did the Black landowners have a common language besides English?
There's not one experience for these. So some of these farmers were coming from Pennsylvania and New York. Some African-American historians have called them Afro-Yankees. So they're long free and they're coming out to Michigan and Northern Ohio, because if you're a farmer, you want to farm in the climate that you can grow in, you can grow stuff in, right? Whereas the farmers that are coming out of Kentucky, North Carolina, Virginia, they're trying to settle as far south in Ohio, Illinois, and Indiana as they can, because they're bringing seed with them that they know needs a certain kind of growing climate. Some of them are born enslaved. They're freedom entrepreneurs. They purchase themselves working extra time while enslaved. Some of them are freedom seekers. Some of them have been free for generations. But there was this really interesting dynamic that some of the earliest and most successful settlers were very, very dark-skinned, which created this sort of reverse elite, so that the keystone settlers in some of these communities in Indiana and Illinois were the wealthiest and the darkest skinned before the Civil War. But in terms of language, I don't know. I mean, I'm always struck by all of them use the term ground instead of land. And whenever they do, they say my ground, or when I'm working my ground, or their love for the ground. I always think of the term sacred ground, right? And in terms of shared stories, before the Civil War, one of the most powerful biblical stories for these families was not the Exodus story from the Old Testament. It was the Joseph story, right? Where a young man is sold into enslavement by his own brothers, and yet manages to get free and to rise. So there's a whole cultural reality we are missing. And I just wrote one book. I mean, it's going to take 1,000 historians, 100 years to even begin to uncover this history that's been denied for so long. I hope more join the field.
Michelle Brown says that I recently read that 99% of land in the U.S. is owned by white people, and I wonder if it is even worse in Ohio. Are you seeing any improvement anywhere in the country, and what policies and actions are helping?
You know, I'm not the best person to talk about the current situation and the current crisis for Black farming, because I really am an historian, and I have talked to some of these multi-generational Midwestern farmers. I know they're trying to reach out. I'd say the biggest crisis in the Midwest is that a lot of these farmers are aging out. And it's been so hard, and it's been such a struggle, and the racism has been so bad in the last even 50 years. So a lot of them, their children do not want to take that on. I mean, it's just too devastating. But some of them are trying, but you do see this rise in urban farming, which is really exciting, that's occurring. And a lot of these multi-generational farmers are saying, you know, we really hope that young African-American people will realize this is possible, this is a reality, and we're out here. And, you know, we'd love for young people to know that we're out here and we're doing this work. And we're looking, you know, for the next generation to join us.
And then someone asked, do we know the current percentage of African-American farmers in the Midwest states that you researched for your book?
I wish I knew, but I don't. And it's really tricky because the USDA defines farmer in an odd way. It's usually, you know, and I think that's starting to change, but for a lot of these African-American farmers who could not get loans from the USDA, right? They might have been making money as coal miners or truck drivers or seasonal work in order to keep that family ground and continue farming. They still defined themselves as farmers, right? Continuing that generational family legacy. But because they were denied loans and support that basically make it, you know, are essential to farming today, they often had to take different jobs in order to do that. And the USDA was really picky about how they defined farmer. So I think that's one of the things that a lot of these farmers are struggling with, is that they want to be counted and they want to be known, but the USDA is using weird ways to count who counts as a farmer and who doesn't, right?
Natasha Roundtree asks, were there any prominent female farmers during this time? What crops did they grow?
Roundtree, I've come across that name a few times in my research, so I'm glad to hear from you, Natasha. So yes, there were absolutely women farmers who were head of household, who were running their own farms, owning their own land. Sometimes they were widowed, but sometimes they were single with no children before the Civil War. So that was absolutely, I mean, that could be its whole book. I mean, if you look at that map in the front of the Bone and Sinew of the Land, I've often thought every single one of those settlements should be a book. But there are some farmers within those settlements, especially the women farmers, who deserve their own book, you know, because their lives are like a movie. I mean, they're incredible. They're incredibly heroic. I know we've got all these superhero narratives in our nation today, but I tell you, some of the stories that I was able to uncover and describe in my book, these people are the truly American superheroes.
Laura Curlis asks you to tell us about the settlements, like the Geist settlement in Clinton County, Ohio, or Conway settlement near Yellow Springs, and Black farming.
You know, I'd like to go into some more detail, but we could be here all night. You know, as I mentioned in my book, I tried to cover, you know, by the time my book went to press, I'd found over 330 such settlements that were created before the Civil War. I didn't do in-depth research on every single one of them, but I do know there's some important stories from those settlements around Yellow Springs and some really, really important propertied farmers who are doing incredibly important work. I would direct you to my book, and then feel free to email me further questions if you have questions about a specific settlement, because I had a really harsh editor who was like, you can't include all the information. So I do have information about some of these settlements that I wasn't able to include in my book.
I would just like to make a quick comment. If you're putting questions into the chat, make sure you transfer those questions into the Q&A section, because that's where Kevin is reading those questions from.
And then the next question asks, can you share a bit about what kinds of resources you use to uncover this perspective of history? Was the digging for this history different from the digging for other history? In other words, was it all there in plain sight, and now is the first time when people with power are actually trying to understand history through the lens of racial justice?
Great question. You know, there's this myth I keep hearing from historians that, well, it's really, really hard to find the history of African Americans. It's almost impossible, right? Actually, it's not that hard. It is hiding in plain sight. I mean, all of these settlements, most of them I found through census research, right? Some of it took traveling to individual counties to look through land deeds and county courthouses, like big old land deeds, 150, 200 years old, but it's not impossible. And there's actually so many written narratives and written material left by these settlers, many of whom were literate and wanted their stories to be known. I would say the biggest issue that I had and the biggest challenge I had in writing this book was not finding the information. It was narrowing it down, because there was an overwhelming amount of information, and it was really, really hard to cut it out and to edit it, because these stories deserve to be known. These stories deserve to be told.
Savannah Williams asks, have you found evidence of cooperation between the Black pioneer farmers and Native peoples in the Midwest during this period?
Interesting question, Savannah Williams. It's a complicated history. So in some cases, yes. I found it in Michigan. I found it around some communities in Ohio. Every region is different, but we have to remember, and this is a tricky one, right, is that some of these African descended pioneers, what they were trying to do to sort of get ahead, help their families, was to own land and farm it. Well, that was in opposition to the indigenous people in that region. So there were, I mean, we've all heard of the Buffalo Soldiers, right, after the Civil War, but there were the equivalent of that in the Wabash River Valley. The Tans and the Andersons were actually what are called Indian Scouts, who were fighting indigenous people in that region during the War of 1812 and even before. They were part of basically the people who built the forts, right? But there are different periods and different people. This is not one history. So the other group are the Afro-French, and I talk about them at some length in my book, but these are people who were in the Midwest and the Great Lakes region by the 1710s, the 1720s, before this region was the United States, right? And they have a very different relationship with the indigenous people. They are trading with them, they're marrying into these people. And in fact, I talk a little bit about the Bonga family, but there are other families like this who are multi-generational Afro-French in the Midwest by the time African-American pioneers start moving out there. So this is a really complicated history. It needs a lot more research and work to be done, to be unpacked.
Crystal Johnson asked, did you come across any stories of interracial farming families in Ohio? My great-great paternal grandparents were married farmers, and my great-great-grandfather was actually white, passing as mulatto outside of Cedarville, Ohio. He did this to marry my great-great-grandmother, who was Black.
That is a wonderful story. And yes, there's actually more history of interracial marriage going on in this region before the Civil War than there is in a lot of these regions in the 20th century. And in fact, in frontier Wisconsin, I found a number of interracial families that were blended in the most incredible ways. So for example, by 1860, so they'd arrived there before Laura Ingalls Wilder and her family built their little house in the big woods, right? So these are families where the man is African-American, propertied, already a skilled farmer. He might have come originally from Pennsylvania. He's marrying a German immigrant woman, but they're both, he's a widower, she's widowed. So she comes to the family with her own children from her white husband who's now dead. He comes to the family with his children from his Black wife who's now died. They have children of their own, right? This is like a whole different version of the Brady Bunch. But these are the families that are living on the Midwestern frontier. And their stories are also really important when we think about identity. And for a lot of these multi-generational families, it's really important that they can self-identify as they see fit, because honestly, most African descended people in the Midwest and in the nation have been in this country, in the United States, for generations and generations. And they have almost every nation inside of them, right? They might have Scottish and Irish and Ghanaian and Narragansett. And so that is also a big sort of an interesting discussion that occurs around some of these farming families that have deep roots in the Midwest.
Frankie Porsche asks if you could spell Edward's last name.
Edward, okay, Abdi. So sorry, that's a weird word. A as in apple, B as in boy, D as in David, Y as in yellow. And I will send that link to Rachel as well, if she could put it up. But his book, it's E. Abdi. I think it just is the first initial, and it's called Travels in the United States, but I'll double check that. It's cited fully and quoted in my book, The Bone and Sinew of the Land. And so you can find that there as well. But his is a 2-volume description of his trips and travels around the United States. He's not only anti-slavery, he's anti-racist. And there is a difference there. A lot of abolitionists and anti-slavery whites, even in Ohio, were extremely racist. But Abdi is both anti-slavery and anti-racist. And in 1833, he comes up with the term Africo-American. I almost used it in my book, but it sounded so clunky. I just couldn't. But his understanding of what was going on in the United States during that really dark decade of so much violence against African Americans in the cities and rural regions of the United States is really profound and interesting.
We have time for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. Kenetta Sanford asks, were any of the farms that you found land trust farms like new communities?
I'm not quite sure if I understand the question.
The land trust is a form of ownership where the land is held in trust by the community as a way of usually controlling prices or appreciation in places where prices are going up. Yeah,
I'm not sure if I found that, and it wasn't so much of a discussion. I know there's a couple situations where African-American families and these multi-generational farming families have banded together to keep the land in the family, and they own it as a sort of family unit, might rent it out. So they keep that ground, that home ground, in the family. But I'm not quite sure of all the legal ways that that's being done at the moment.
And this is going to be the last question from Nikki Patterson.
And do remember, yeah, I can respond to emails afterwards.
Right. Yeah. Please share. Oh, she's asking us to. The speaker is Annalisa Cox, and the book is The Bone and Sinew of the Land. And the information, this recording will be up on the website for Community Solutions very soon. So I think that's a good note for us to end on. Annalisa Cox, thank you so much for sharing this information with us. And as she mentioned, we will share her information if you want to follow up with her. Again, we'll have the recording of this event on our website for Community Solutions. And Rachel Isaacson, is there any closing housekeeping information about
I wanted
tomorrow?
to thank everybody for their wonderful questions and for coming tonight. It's been really wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to, sorry. I just want to say, take a chance to review the program as well as the resources that Annalisa provided that I offered in the chat. Community Solutions will be offering a video, we'll be posting this video recording on our YouTube channel shortly after the conference, and we'll make sure that everyone who registered for this event will make sure to let them know when it got posted and where it's going to be.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you especially to all the organizers. I appreciate it.
Yes, again, thank you everybody who registered, and we look forward to seeing you tomorrow.
Yep, join us tomorrow.
10 o'clock restart, and thank you.